Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm still a practitioner. I still work with people. I still work with children who are going through the Scottish legal system. And I still work with people who may be facing deportation from the UK because they may have committed a small crime, or because they may be trafficked, or that certainly the UK government doesn't want them living in the UK. Now, I come from a very small country. I come from Scotland. And isn't it wonderful that some people from very small countries can sometimes become global presidents? And this is an invitation for you to think about your involvement from the Czech Republic and from Hungary and from Slovakia, and just to think about the impact you can have on global affairs from a very small practice space. So here we are. I was last here in 1993. It was a very different country. It was just after the wall came down in Berlin, and there was a great sense of optimism. And I'm now back here today, and when I was driving through your country, very beautiful, but I noticed there was a big difference between people who have a big economy, very strong incomes, and some very, very poor people living in the Czech Republic. And it is that gap that is getting wider and is most challenging for us as social workers, as people move in different directions within us communities. This is not uncommon. This is happening all over the world. It's happening in Greece, it's happening in Portugal, it's happening in Japan, it's happening in America, it's happening in Australia. And the need for social workers working with people to meet social need and to help people find happier places to live in their communities has become more and more essential. So I like to think that social work is not an endangered species, that in fact we are growing in strength, and we are growing in strength globally. The federation that I'm now president of has millions of social workers around the world, all doing the same kind of work that you're doing, that I'm doing, that everybody else who's been invited to speak is doing. And that's really important to know, that you're not alone in this journey. I want to talk about two cases from practice. But I also want to start because I was intrigued to find that in your new law, there's a big section being debated about ethics. And I want to support that because in the work that I do now across the world, I get faced with all sorts of different questions from different social workers working in different systems. And do you know, the General Secretary and myself spend 3/4 of our time talking about the ethics, about how we might suggest somebody moves something on. And it's actually our ethical statement at IFSW that guides everything that we do. So it's a really, really important part of being a social worker, is having a really strong ethical code and ethical statement. So I would commend you all to be campaigning for that to be in your law, because it's really absolutely critical to how we can face some of the challenges that we've just been hearing about from the trafficking of people. So I'm going to talk about social work. Are you familiar with this? This is the international definition of social work. Can you put your hands up if you know what I'm talking about? Right, few of you. For those that don't know, this is the agreed definition of social work that was agreed by the schools of social work and by the practitioners. Now, I think in many countries have now written this into their law. And it's a really good statement about what social workers do and the role that social workers play in their country. But I want to concentrate on the second line. Social work is a practice-based profession and an academic discipline that promotes social change. And that's the bit I want to concentrate on. How do we promote social change? Because actually, if you don't have social change and social cohesion and good development, you do not have economic development. You have to have the social cohesion before you have the basis for the economic development. And that's what a lot of our politicians miss. They don't understand our role. And they don't understand it because we don't articulate it, we don't talk about it very well. And it's best done, we can do it individually. I can stand here as a global president and do it. But if you all say it, if you all say, this is really, really important, then we can get a whole lot further in explaining the strength of social work and what it can actually achieve. And the last bit of this that I want to pick up on is at the bottom here. Social work engages people and structures to address life challenges and enhance well-being. That's what we do. Small task, but you'll manage it. So let's talk about people and change. There's planned change, and there's forced change. And we've just been hearing about forced change, what the effect is on people when they have forced change. Planned change is what we all like. We all like to move forward and get new things happening. So how do you cope with change? This is normal change. This is the kind of change that people have in the course of their lives. How do you cope with moving house? Oh, packing those boxes, putting everything away, and then finding in your new place somewhere to put your new things or your old things. Changing job. That can be stressful. Getting married can be stressful. You have to find you discover a whole extension of your family with your in-laws, for good or evil. There we have new relationships. When we go into new relationships, there's always a negotiation about how that will work. And then when you get new children, well, they grow up, don't they? And they're changing all the time. We're dealing with change in our lives all of the time. And when we have new caring responsibilities, an elderly parent who develops dementia, these are normal changes everybody goes through. And there is an assumption by politicians that this is how everybody copes with change. But we know it's different because not everybody copes with change in that way. Because there are nice ways of going on journeys through life. You book an air ticket to go on holiday, take a train trip somewhere, or you bicycle when it's flat, or you go on a boat. There are all sorts of nice journeys people can take. And you get a great sense of well-being when you're on a journey and you get to your destination and you've gone the route that you planned and you haven't been diverted by some traffic works that are happening around a village and you've got completely lost and you don't know the language that of the signs that you're working for. And you think, thank goodness for TomTom and things like satellites and things like that. And there are planned routes, and people feel very safe in that. Okay? Then there are traumatic journeys. And that's what we're talking about. That's what we've been talking about this morning. People who've been trafficked. They go through traumatic journeys. They may come from wars. They may come from plane crashes. They may come from train crashes. And that wee person in the corner there says it all about the effects that that has on an individual. And where we come in as social workers is that we meet the need of the person who's been involved in that traumatic journey. That's the journey, but I want to talk about what happens in some of the structures and about one of the other key components that I think is really important in thinking about social work and how we can be effective. And that is about power and control. Because I think that when I was listening to the description this morning about the organization, and you had that slide up of all the different systems that are there to help people who have been trafficked, and they're complex, and how can anybody work their way around finding a route to finding some help in a system that has 10 cantons, two entities, and so many different layers of systems, and so many different opportunities for what I would call system abuse, because we get caught up in the bureaucracy, and I expect all of you here as social workers will know about bureaucracy, because that's how what we're expected to do, keep notes, keep files, keep records. And do we have time to meet people, to hear their journeys, to hear their stories? And one of the things about systems that operate like that is that they exercise power and control over what we do as social workers, as well as as well as rationing how people can access services. Now, you do need some order, do need some systems, but when you get over control and over systemized, it prevents people dealing with the issues that you have to deal with. So we have positive power, like electricity, and we have negative power, somebody being handcuffed and with limitations. We have the kind of power where you feel somebody's looking over your shoulder all the time, and that's really difficult for you then to feel free to work in the way that you want to work. And you also have the kind of power that's illustrated in the top. Power and control are big issues in social work. And being out of control adds to the trauma of your journey. And one of the things that is important for refugees, and these are the type of tent villages that are around Vienna and Munich at the moment, because that's the best that can be provided for people. And you've arrived from being trafficked, from coming from Syria, from coming from Africa, from coming from a war, from drought, and you've been trafficked by people, you've lost your money, you've lost everything, and you end up in a tented village like that. How much do you feel in control of your destiny? And what happens when you feel out of control? You become angry, you become frustrated. And so different emotions are coming into that change process. these are some of the things that you will feel. Fear. You're a victim of power and control. You're disempowered. You have reduced resilience. You don't have the capacity to move things on. And you find that your goal is further and further away from where you want to be. But in order to have got where you have arrived, you have huge survival skills, which have to be positive. And you've got skills that you have brought with you. One of the messages that I've had from Caritas, working in Munich, and they've been working in Italy and in Austria as well, is that they have been recruiting Syrian-trained social workers who are part of the refugee population to work with them, to helping people on their journeys to Germany or wherever they want to go to. So we sometimes forget that in this group, we also have some very positive skills of people who are already trained, who already understand the culture of the people who are coming on these journeys, and we are not thinking imaginatively about how we can use those skills. And so there are some real messages about us rethinking some of our humanitarian aid kind of responses to issues like trafficking and refugees and people who are in very traumatized ways of living at the moment. So it's about recognizing what it is that people are experiencing and listening to that, but also recognizing that they have positives within themselves. And when I was a very young social worker, I always remember a very wise person saying to me, you see many negatives in social work attached to people. Put those to one side. Remember they're there because they're important. But if you're going to effect change, you have to go for the positives. You have to go for the skills that are there and where people want to be. So, how many of you recognize this triangle? I should think a few. Oh, come on, there were only 3 or 4. Come on, everybody should recognize this triangle. But, you know, it's still valid now, isn't it? Because this is where humanitarian aid comes in. UN aid, the humanitarian UN refugee crisis lot. Great, they do a wonderful job. But it isn't social work. It's about meeting a basic human need. This bit is where we begin in social work, creating safety. Because until somebody feels safe, they're not going to talk to you about anything or anyone. And this is often where we miss a trick or two about how we approach this particular area of intervention. Because if we concentrated a bit more on this, some of the other ones would fall into place a little bit more easily, and we wouldn't be spending a lot of money on longer term interventions. Because once you get to esteem, people are usually on an upward spiral, and they can go themselves, or they can be helped by other agencies. This bit is about the time when we have to help people feel safe. And one of the things that I've been involved in quite recently has been working with and listening to people who were abused when they were in public care as children. This is a big issue in the UK, and it's been in the churches, and it's been in boarding schools, that children have been abused when they have been looked after and been cared for in what were technically safe places. And yet a member of staff or an older child has abused someone. And one of the things that is really important to know is that when you are a child and there's all that power and control around you, which is providing all your so-called safety, you feel very silent. You cannot speak out about what is happening to you. So safety is really a very important part of where we come in, because we have, as a profession, often missed the fact that what technically looks like a safe environment actually is not a safe environment. And I think that was being talked about in terms of people apply the process now of applying for a job online. You meet the businessman in the hotel, it all goes well, and then you find yourself being sold for 500 euros into sex slavery or into whatever it is. And so we have to think about what is really safe and what is just a cloak to cover up for criminal activity. And some of the things that people have said to me who have been survivors of this is the important bit is that they met somebody during their journey around here who actually connected with them, who actually made a difference to them. Not a process, not a system, but a person. And one of the things that we as social workers have to do is remember that we are people first and social workers second. Because if we're going to work with someone, they're going to work with us as a person, not with us as a social worker. Because as a social worker, I could be a social administrator, I could be giving advice, I could be anybody. But as a person, that is who somebody who's been on a traumatized journey will go to, will be a person whom they can trust. And that special social relationship is what makes us unique from the lawyer, from the advice giver, from the policeman, from the ambulance man, from the nurse, whatever. We are not there to do a technical job. We are there to engage. Remember that word in the definition of social work? We are there to engage with the person. I'm going to talk about my first case example. This is from my practice. I met Jane when she was 21 years old. By this time, she'd had 10 suicide attempts in 2 years. She'd gone through school and university. First year in university, it wasn't as structured as school. School can be very structured, very safe place to be. Once you get to university, there are more things around, you get more distractions, you enter into a whole new set of relationships. And if you have been in a traumatic journey, this is a time when it falls apart. And we know from quite a lot of work with first-year university students, we will come across a number of young people who have been very, very seriously abused in their childhood. And this was the case with Jane. And it took her 10 years to get to a point where she could actually really talk about the sexual abuse by her father and her brother and her mother, and about her feelings, and this was much more difficult for her, her feelings about her mother, who had learning disabilities, and her failure to protect her. Now, that's a bit of a traumatic journey to make in 2 years, from going to be very successful at school to 10 suicide attempts in your first year at university. And I'm talking serious suicide attempts. She attempted to jump off Salisbury Crags, and very few people survived that one. She just had 2 broken legs. But most people who jump off Salisbury Crags in Edinburgh do actually kill themselves. So these were serious attempts on her life. The journey that she took was really affected, or things started to change for her when she met a social worker called Heather. And Heather stayed with her for about the next 20 years, being her social worker. And that relationship has led her now to a point where she's been able to go back to university, complete her degree, and write very successfully. She writes a lot of poetry, and she's also written a book about her recovery. And she contributes a lot now to society. She's in employment. If that relationship had not existed, I don't think Jane would be alive today. I came into her life at a period when we had to work on these 2 issues, the sexual abuse and her feelings about her mother, who hadn't been there to protect her. And she described I met her unfortunately her other social worker had recently died, and she'd given the funeral oration about how wonderful this social worker was. And about 6 months later, I met her in the street, and she said, well, I had 2 really good social workers, she said. I had my really nice social worker who was there for me. I trusted her implicitly. But I had you. You were the short, sharp shock, because I had to deal with these issues. And I think there's actually a lot to be said for thinking about what type of social worker we bring. What do we bring to the particular work that we're doing? Because there are all sorts of different types of social work. But they're all equally important, and all might be more useful to a person at one time in their life than another. So this case has taken us from somebody who was functioning really well up until the age of 18, through 10 years of absolute trauma, and then the period now that we're in, 15, 20 years later, where she's a really strong person in our society who's contributing a great deal to to understanding social need and what happens to people who have survived that kind of abuse. This is a different type of social work. This is community social work. You may remember a couple of years back there was a really strong typhoon in the Philippines. And we have 2 villages on 2 different islands, absolutely devastated. So this is a really good case comparison. You couldn't have wanted anything better in terms of understanding the difference that social work can make. 2 similar communities, 2 huge amounts of humanitarian aid coming in from all the aid organizations, arrives on their doorstep, and they deal with it in 2 different ways, and they have 2 different outcomes. And the first one, the humanitarian aid NGOs said, oh, it's silly having your village down on that corner of the island by the beach, because it's open to more typhoons coming and destroying your village. You need to build it in the middle of the island. And the villagers said, that's no use to us. Our main trade is fishing. We need to be on the coast. So, okay, we go back onto the coast. But what they were able to negotiate is a safer place further around the coast, which wouldn't have been so open to being devastated if another typhoon of that magnitude came back again. But what was really interesting about this one was that they had social workers who were part of the planning group who knew the islanders already. So they knew the culture, they knew how people worked. And what they started to do was to say, a Dutch company came in to build some housing for them. And they said, no, show us how to build this house, and then we will build the rest. So they showed them how to build the house, and then the villagers built the rest of the houses themselves. And from building the houses, they were able to pay wages immediately. And that made a huge difference to how people looked at their recovery, because they were in ownership of it. And they built their boats, and they went out fishing again, and they've got a thriving economy back to where they were. That was really, really important. The other village is still waiting. They're still waiting because they expect humanitarian aid to rebuild their village for them, and they're still living in the chaos and the debris that was around just after the typhoon. So really good examples about engaging with communities. So if you're talking about community social work, you've got to think, what does the community want? What do they want? It's nothing to do with us because we're not living there, unless we are living there, in which case you can be part of that rebuilding. But really, really important to work with that. And I think one of the skills that we have as social workers is we ask questions. And it's through asking questions that we empower people. Because I can ask a question, I expect you to give me an answer. I can ask a question which will be a question to you to ask yourself a question to which you have to find the answer to your own question. Do you understand that? It's a complex way of doing things. Here it is. Social workers ask questions so that people ask themselves the questions to help them find the answers. We don't know what are the questions that they want to find answers to. So we have to be more subtle in our questions. They have to be open questions, because we have to find out what they want to change. It's not what we want to change, it's what they want to change. Because if you haven't got them engaged in the process of change, then they won't change. They'll go away. They'll go do their own thing anyway. And it's that co-construction that the solution comes from working together. You need to think about this question about how do you ask questions? Because they're not our questions. The questions about how people change will come from themselves. You think about when you're moving house, or when you're changing jobs, and you think about how you will do it. And you'll get lots of advice, particularly from your in-laws and your family, about how you can move house so much better than the way that you've organized it. And it's useless, because you haven't heard them, because it isn't your solution. So you have to own the solution. So you have to own the question. And that's what that part of social work is about. We're not social administrators. We're not there to document people when they come into the country. which is what's happening. Some social workers in Austria are spending their time sitting at desks, writing identification papers for people. That is not a good use of social work. We're not there to help them get into the social protection floor, because the people that we work with are the people who live under the floorboards, who are not being covered by social protection. And this is not how social work skills should be used. We have to be really clear about what our skills are that are going to help people find change. And we have to be working with the politicians and the administrators so that they understand how to use our skills better. I've just come from a conference of 1,000 social workers from across Europe. And one of the things that came up out of the refugee crisis and about a couple of other things that have happened, the airline crash that happened in the Netherlands and some of the disasters that have been going around the world, is that we're beginning to write guidelines for social workers, or a book to help people think about disaster planning. Because a lot of the traumatic things that we're talking about today could be termed as disasters, or because they happen to us suddenly and we don't anticipate them. We can't plan for them. You can, we know that so many of our older people are going to get dementia, and so we can plan for that. We know that so many people will have car crashes, and therefore we can plan for rehabilitation after, that kind of thing. But disasters we can't plan for, and we don't know what they're going to be. And we divided this into 4 sections because there's a disaster itself, which happens, and there's a great rush round, and there've been all the people going to the railway stations in Budapest and Vienna and Munich with volunteering to do this, that, and the other, take people home with them, and all the rest of it. But A, that isn't necessarily what the refugee wants, and B, it probably isn't going to be a long-term solution. It's an immediate reaction. What we have to think about is the 12 months post-disaster, because going back to Maslow's triangle, you've got that place where it says safety. And one of the problems that we have at the moment is that the systems are dictating what is a safe place, which might be in a holding area like a refugee tent camp, one of the fields where you've got lots of tents, and that might be the answer for the immediate problem. But it doesn't actually help people as the winter comes in, the snow comes down, and what are we going to do next when in that 12 months post-disaster? And we can do what the Germans are doing at the moment, which is to find housing for people. That gives them the shelter. But it doesn't give them the integration or the way into the community in which they're living, that social need. We're very good at meeting physical need, but we're not very good at doing the thinking about what we need for the social needs for people. And one of the things why I took the case of Jane was to say that if you've had a traumatic experience, it isn't going to be sorted out in 12 months. Remember, it took her 10 years to get to one place and another 20 years to get to being an integrated person in the community. So for many refugees, and you can think back to the end of the World War II and think about how long it took people to build new communities. 20 to 30 years. And that's a minimum, I would suggest. I think sometimes it can take longer for communities to really assimilate all the new people that are in their community. And then there is the question in that 20 to 30 years, are you talking about assimilation, integration, cohesion, inclusion, and how do you decide what it is you're looking for? And might it be a good idea to ask, and this is where the social worker in me comes out, because I'm going to ask you the question to ask yourselves, might it be a good idea to ask the people in the current communities and the refugees coming into those communities, ask them both what they might want as goals for their community in 20 to 30 years' time, and help them plan together about how they might make that the kind of community that they both want to live in. Because that's the task. And if we don't ask the communities, and if we just assume that, you know, the community is offering this, and the refugees are looking for that, they will never be integrated, included, or whatever word you want to use. They will be working in parallel with each other, and you will form ghettos. And we don't want ghettos, do we? So you've got to think about that when you're doing your individual work, about how long it takes people to individually recover, but you've also got to think about communities and how long it takes them to go through that process of social change. One of the things that also comes about, and you can see it seeping into the EU politics and the UN politics. If you've had a disaster, you have to have an investigation. It will either be a public investigation, a political investigation, or it will be in the law courts because somebody will be seeking compensation for what went wrong. And everybody will be seeking social justice and something to be changed. What it does for the victims and the social workers is it relives the trauma. And nobody ever talks about that. But I can tell you, having worked as the manager for the Scottish Association of Social Workers for 15 years, the Lockerbie bomb went down in, 30 years ago? And when Megrahi was let out of prison to go and die in his own country because the politicians in charge of that in Scotland took a compassionate view about a man who may well have been innocent and where he needed to find his peace and his end of life, and he was released. Everybody, the media, were there, reliving the trauma of Lockerbie 30 years on. And the social workers who were involved with picking up the pieces afterwards and working with the victims and the families, they came to see me and they said, it's happened again. What can we do? Because they were reliving their nightmares of what they'd had to work through. And I think this is a part where we as social workers need to take care of ourselves as well, because that's actually we are working at some of the very hard end of people's traumatic experiences. So, my almost final slide. Understand what the person sees as their goal. It may be different from yours and the other partners. Be very clear. It's not our change, it's the person's change. Understand what they see as a socially just outcome. It may be different from yours. It may be different from the politicians who want to just sweep everything under the carpet. I'm just finishing here. You've got to listen to people. Take your two communities, the community that's already been there and the refugees coming into the community. Listen to them. Do the analysis together. Co-construct a way forward. That's the way to work. And change will only happen when the partners are engaged in the same project, working in the same direction. That's fairly straightforward, I think, but you think about how many projects you've been involved with where people haven't been agreeing that the outcome is the same that you're working towards. We're not advice givers, we're not social administrators. Understand your own skills and be proud of them. They're really important for people, for those we work with. Social engagement, that's as far as I go on inclusion, cohesion or anything else. Social engagement leads to financial engagement that leads to healthy, sustainable societies and happy communities. And we're doing it for people like her. Thank you.